Hello there, welcome back again. So today I'll be showing you how I went about making this off-shoulder bustier dress. This dress is so beautiful and it's a combination of Ankara and plain fabric. Without wasting much time, please do well to watch this video to the end. Like, share and subscribe, and let's get started. Now to begin, these are the materials I'll be needing. I have this crepe fabric here. I made use of about 2 yards of it for the black part of the dress. And then I have this Ankara here. This is 6 yards, but in total I made use of about 4 yards. And then I have my bra cup here. Just try to find one that is closest to your bust size. And I have my marker, my scissors, my rollers, my pattern paper and other things that are not shown here like thread and the rest. Now on my pattern paper, I'll start by rolling out my shoulder line, which is also going to serve as my starting line just at the top of the paper. And then from the midpoint of this paper, this edge is serving as the midpoint. I'm marking in my neck width of 3 inches, and next my shoulder to shoulder measurements divided by 2, which is 7.5 inches. From that shoulder point, I'm marking down my chest line, which is 8 inches. I'm confirming the shoulder to shoulder measurements down here, and I'll connect from this chest point upwards to the shoulder line. And on that shoulder point, I've just marked down 1 inch, and I'll slant this 1 inch to my neck width of 3 inches. That is my shoulder slope right there. And then I'm going to just extend this chest line inwards this way. And I'm just going to mark the midpoint from the shoulder slope to the chest line, and then I'll go in on that midpoint by 0.75 inches. On the chest line, I'll mark my bust circumference divided by 4, and I'm going to curve out my armhole curve. So from the chest line to the midpoint of that line, and then upwards to the shoulder slope. Now from the starting line, I'm going to mark my shoulder to my bust point at 10.5 inches, shoulder to under bust at 14 inches, shoulder to waistline at 17 inches. I'm going to mark it on the other end of the paper, and I'll use my ruler to connect the point with a straight line. So I'm going to draw out my bust point line, my under bust line, and my waistline. Now I'm going to mark for my waistline to my hip line now. So for my waist to hip is 8 inches. So I'll just mark 8 inches right there, and I'm going to measure from my waist to knee, which is actually 19 inches, but 18 inches is where the paper stops here. So I'll mark 18 inches here on paper as my waist to knee, and I'll replace the other 1 inch on the fabric. I'm going to roll out my hip line and also the knee line. Now to label all the lines I have drawn out here, I have my starting line from the top. Next, I have my chest line, then I have my bust point line, my under bust line, my waistline right here, I have my hip line, and then I have my knee line. Now back to the top of the paper, I'm going to mark out my neck depth, or rather where I want my dress to start from. So I want it to start from 7 inches, and which is just 1 inch above my chest line. So I'm going to mark 7 inches there, and then on that 7 inches point, I'll mark my nipple to nipple measurement divided by 2. I'm marking it on the 7 inches point there on my bust point line, my under bust line, my waistline, and on my hip line, I'm just going to go above my hip line by 1 inch, and I'm also going to mark my nipple to nipple measurement right there. So that is 4 inches. My nipple to nipple divided by 2 is 4 inches. I'm using a straight line to connect all these points together. So this is just a basic dart line. Now on the bust point line, I'm going to go up by 2.5 inches. So you can see where I'm placing my tape, just at the midpoint, the edge of the paper, and I'm going to make like a little sweetheart curve to that 7-inch mark I made there, and then into the armhole. I'm just going to curve it into the armhole nicely. If you want your sweetheart curve to be deeper, you can go up from the bust point line by 1 inch or 1.5 inches and not 2.5 inches like I did. Now moving on to mark out my dart. On the under bust line toward the side, I'm going to mark 1 inch, and toward the center, I'm going to mark 0.75 inches. Now I usually mark 1.5 inches and 1 inch respectively, but since I'm going to be closing this dart on paper, I don't want to have difficulties because I'm not going to sew this dart on my fabric. So it's easier to sew the dart, to cut through the dart on the paper and sew it on the fabric, but I want to close this dart on paper, so I don't want to have difficulties while I'm doing that. Now moving to my waistline, I'm going to mark 0.75 inches on both sides of the dart line on my waistline, and I'm going to use my ruler to connect it to my hip line point upwards this way, straight up like this, and then I'm going to take it straight as well to the under bust line. So now if you're on a bigger side, maybe your bust is bigger, you might want to use 1.5 inches toward the side and 1 inch toward the center, or even 2 inches toward the side and 1.5 inches toward the center. That's on the under bust line. So I really hope you understand what I'm saying. I have other videos where I explain this bustier better, so please do well to check it out. Now using my curve ruler, I'm just going to make a curve from the under bust to the bust point line. And now on this 7 inches mark, let's just call this the chest line, I'm going to mark 0.75 inches on both sides of the dart line. And also using a curve, I'm just going to blend this into the bust point line as well. So just with a slight curve, I'm going to blend this in just like this. And then after doing that, I'll go on to just take my measurements on the side. Now on the chest line, I'm going to mark my bust circumference measurement divided by 4. I'll replace this dart intake here of 1.5 inches, and then I'm going to add 1.5 inches for sewing allowance. Moving to my waistline, I'll mark my waist measurement divided by 4. I'll replace the dart intake of 1.5 inches, and I'll add 1.5 inches for sewing allowance. You can also go on to take your under bust measurement and replace the dart intake as well, but it doesn't really make any difference for me. Now using my curved ruler, I'm going to connect from my chest line to my waistline, and then on my hip line, I'm going to mark my hip circumference measurement divided by 4, which is 10.25 inches, and I'm only going to add my sewing allowance of 1.5 inches. Now for the measurement of my knee line, I'll take the entire measurement I have on my hip line, which is about 11.75 inches. I'll mark that on my knee line, and I'm going to subtract 1.5 inches from that entire measurement. So taking off some inches from the knee line is going to give it that penciled effect. Now using my ruler, I'm going to connect from my waistline to my hip line, and from my hip line down to my knee line. Now the next thing I'm going to do is to mark out my side dart. And on the bust point line, I'm going to measure down 1.5 inches, which is the measurement for my side dart. And on this dart line, still on the bust point line, I'll go out by 1 inch, and I'm going to slant from that 1 inch down to the 1.5 inches on the side. Now I'll go on to close this side dart because I don't want to sew it on the fabric. So picking one of the lines, I'll just place it over the other and use my pins to hold it in place. I have talked a lot about side dart, so I don't think this should be news by now. I'll replace whatever shortage I have right there, and I'll go on to just cut everything out. Now I'm done cutting, I'll go on to separate the bust from the rest of the body. Now on the under bust line, on the midpoint right here, I'll go upwards by 2.5 inches. You can go as high as you want, but I decided to work with 2.5 inches. And I'm going to blend this into the under bust line and then to the side. So on the chest line right there, I'll go in by 1 inch from the actual bust measurement, because I don't want the allowance to be included in this curve. Now I'm going to just curve from the center of the paper into the under bust line and now to the side. So using my curve ruler, you can see how I'm placing it, just with a slight curve, not too deep, and then I'm going to continue all the way from the under bust into the side. So I'm basically just trying to make a cup. Now after drawing out the curve, I'll use my scissors to just cut it out. And the next thing I'll do is to take off the darts on this cup. So I'll be cutting off the darts here. I'm not going to close the dart on the cup. So by the time I cut it out on the fabric and sew it together, it's going to have a better shape. Now after cutting these, I'll just use arrows to indicate which side is facing which side. It is pretty obvious without the arrows. And now on the main body of the paper, I would go on to slash one of the dart lines, and I'll place it over the other one so that I can easily close the dart on this paper. I'll use my pins to just hold it in place, and this is everything for the front piece. So I decided to not sew my dart on fabric. That's why I sewed it on the paper. So if you want to sew yours on the fabric, you're just going to have to slash through to the end of the paper, cut off your darts, add allowance all around, and then you sew it on your fabric. I hope you understand. Now we're done with the front pattern, we'll go on to draft out the back. Please pardon this pattern paper I have here. So from the midpoint of the paper, I will first of all go in by 1.5 inches, which is going to serve as a zipper allowance. I'll use my ruler to just draw a straight line from the top of the paper down to the end. Next, I'm going to mark my starting line, which is also the shoulder line. So I'm just marking down about 0.5 inches from the top of the pattern paper. I'll roll a straight line across right there, and then from the midpoint of the paper, which is the zipper allowance line, I'll mark 3 inches as my neck width, and then I'm marking 7.5 inches as my shoulder to shoulder divided by 2. From that shoulder point, I've marked down my chest line, which is 8 inches. I'm going to connect from my chest line upwards to the shoulder line. I'm also going to draw out my chest line inwards this way. Next, I'm going to come down by 1 inch for my shoulder slope. I'll slant it to my neck width of 3 inches, and I'll go on to mark the midpoint from the shoulder slope to the chest line. I'll go inwards by 0.5 inches, and on my chest line I'm going to mark my bust circumference divided by 4, and I'll go on to connect my armhole curve this way. Now I'm placing my tape on the shoulder line. I'm going to mark my shoulder to bust point, which is 10.5 inches. Next, my shoulder to waistline. So there's no under bust for the back. So I'm just going to mark my shoulder to waistline, which is 15.5 inches. So shoulder to waist in front is 17 inches. Shoulder to waist behind is 15.5 inches. That's how I was able to subtract and have 1.5 inches for the side dart. So just to say again, you get your side dart measurement by subtracting your shoulder to waist in front from your shoulder to waist behind. So 17 minus 15.5 is 1.5 inches. Now from the waistline, I'm going to mark down my waist to hip, which is 8 inches, and then I'm going to mark my waist to my knee line, which is 18 inches on paper. Here is actually 19 inches, but I'm marking 18 inches on paper, and I'll add the other 1 inch on the fabric. Now labeling all the lines I have drawn out, I have my starting line, my chest line, bust point line, waist line, hip line, and then my knee line. Now back to the top of the paper, I'll go on to mark where I want the dress to start from. So for the front, I came down from the shoulder by 7 inches, and I'll use the same measurement for the back. So 7 inches is where I want it to start from. I'll roll a straight line this way, and I'll blend it into the armhole. Next, I'll mark my bust band measurement divided by 2 on the bust point line, the waist line, and 1 inch above the hip line. So I'm just going to go up from the hip line this way by 1 inch. I'll take the same measurement of 4 inches, and I'll use my straight ruler to connect these dart lines together. Now on the waistline, I'm going to go out on the waistline by 0.5 inches on both sides of that line. I'll connect the dart lines downwards to the hip line and then upwards to the bust point line. Now I'll go on to mark my body circumference measurements. On the chest line, I'll mark my bust circumference divided by 4. I'll do the same on the bust point line, and I'm going to add 1.5 inches for sewing allowance. On the waistline, I'm going to mark my waist circumference divided by 4. I'll replace the dart intake of 1 inch, and I'll add 1.5 inches for sewing allowance. On the hip line, hip circumference divided by 4. 1.5 inches for sewing allowance. Now on the knee line, I'll take the entire measurement of the hip line. I'll mark that on the knee line, and I'm going to subtract 1.5 inches this time. So this is also what I did for the front. Now I'm just going to use my ruler to connect all the points together on the side, from the chest line to the waistline, and then from the waistline to the hip line, and from the hip line downwards to the knee line. Now I've shaped up the side, I'll go on to shape up the center back. So on the zipper allowance line, on the waistline, I'll take off half an inch. So just to take off any zip bulge, I'm going to slant this half an inch upwards to the starting line and downwards to the hip line. Now on the hip line, I'll go up and down by 1 inch respectively. And then I'm going to just blend this downwards into this 1 inch above the hip line. So just watch what I'm doing. I'm using my ruler to just take it up to the starting line first, and then I'm going to take from that waistline downwards to 1 inch above the hip line, and then crossing over this point from the 1 inch below the hip line, I'm going to blend this into the knee line. So I just made a slant from below the hip line to the knee line. Now this is going to give the back more shape and contour. Now I'll go on to cut everything out. I'll cut the sides, the 7 inches starting line, and also this zipper allowance. After cutting everything out, I'll also be closing the dart on this back piece, because when I say I don't want to sew any darts, I don't want to sew any darts even on the back piece. And this is everything for the back pattern, and now I have my front pieces here as well. I brought in my fabric also. I'll be using the Ankara to cut out the cups, and then I'll be using this crepe fabric to cut out the body of the front and the back pieces. So placing my fabric on a fold here, I'm going to place the front piece first, that's the front body, on it, and I'll make sure that the edge of the paper, the midpoint of the paper, is on the folded edge of this fabric. I'll pin it down properly, and I'll go on to add allowance all around the top except for the side. I'll also be adding the extra 1 inch I said I would for the knee line. So from my waist to knee on the paper is 18 inches, and it's supposed to be 19 inches like I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to replace that 1 inch to make up 19 inches, and I'll also be adding 1 inch for sewing allowance. So I'm just basically adding 2 extra inches below the knee line, and then I'll go on to just cut everything out. Now I'm done cutting out the front pattern. I'll just take off the paper and open it up this way so we can see what we have. So this is it right here. Now I'm going on to cut out the back. I'll place my fabric on a fold again, and I have tried as much as I could to make sure I place this paper flat on the fabric. So because I closed it, that placing the paper on fabric was not so easy. So I used lots of pins for the paper to stay flat on the fabric, and I went on to add about 0.5 inches of allowance all around the top, no allowance on the side because it already has allowance on the paper, and to the lower part as well I added 2 inches also, just like I did for the front. And now I'll proceed to cut it out. So these are my back pieces right here. I'll place this aside so that I can cut out the cups. So I'll be using the Ankara fabric to cut out the cups, like I said. So placing it on a fold also, right sides facing. I'll bring in the cup pieces and I'll be placing this center cup piece on the folded edge of this fabric. So directly on the folded edge, I'll use my pins to hold it down. So I'm going to be cutting one piece for this center cup, if that makes sense. And then for this side cup, it's going to be 2 separate pieces. That is why this one is not on a folded edge. I hope that makes sense. Now I'm going to add 0.5 inches of allowance all around the 2 cup pieces, including the little armhole I have on the side cup piece right there, and then I'll go on to cut everything out. Now I don't think I mentioned earlier, but this is going to be a 2-part tutorial. This video only contains the pattern drafting and cutting for this dress, and I'm going to finish up with the sewing tutorial in my next video, so please do well to check it out. It will be linked in the comments. Now after cutting out the cup here, this is what I have. I'm going to go on to cut out lining pieces for it with a regular lining, and then for the body of the dress I'll be cutting out lining for only the front piece. I won't be cutting out lining for the back, so I'll use the same fabric to cut out the lining for the front. So we've come to the end of this part. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.